Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something, well, huge. It's this massive 940-page mega bill that's really been making waves.
It definitely has.
So let's just start there. What is this bill, really?
Well, at its heart, it's a really sweeping package. You've got a proposal that aims to make the 2017 tax cuts permanent.
Okay.
And alongside that, you see pretty significant bumps in spending for the military and border security.
And it just passed a key vote.
That's right. It just got through a procedural step in the Senate, 51-49, though interestingly, 2 Republicans actually voted no on that.
Huh. Still, 940 pages. That's enormous.
Yeah.
Why the rush? Why is this being pushed through Congress, like, right now with such speed?
Yeah, the timing is definitely something people are pointing to. Pushing it through quickly, especially in a Senate where Republicans have the majority, it suggests they see a specific political opportunity.
No.
And this is despite Democrats really calling for, a full public reading, given how complex it is and the potential impact. But it seems to be on a fast track.
Right. So if you're listening, you're probably wondering, okay, what does this actually mean for me? Who wins here? Who loses?
Exactly.
And maybe the biggest question, if this thing gets fully implemented, what are the real, actual, long-term consequences? For your finances, for your community, for the country?
That's what we need to unpack.
Yeah, that's our mission today. Let's try and unravel that. So let's start with the basics. What's actually in this mega bill? What are the main parts?
Okay, so it kind of has 2 main faces, if you will. One side is definitely the tax cuts, making those 2017 cuts permanent. We're talking estimates around $3.8 trillion in tax reductions over the next decade.
3.8 trillion. Wow.
It's a huge number. And they've also added some new things, sort of populist-sounding exemptions like making tips tax-exempt over time, too, and boosting deductions for some retirees.
Okay, so that's one side. What's the other?
The other side is spending increases.
Yeah.
Significant ones for the military and for border security. The estimates there are around $350 billion more.
Got it. Tax cuts meet spending hikes. What was the immediate reaction when the details started coming out?
Well, the reaction, especially from Democrats, was pretty immediate and very sharp. The main criticisms were that it heavily savors the wealthy and that it could just blow up the national deficit.
Which is already huge.
Exactly, already over $36 trillion. And it wasn't just politicians. You had figures like Elon Musk weighing in pretty strongly, calling the bill a disaster, even an abomination.
Okay, so strong initial reactions. Let's dig into the money side more. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they're the nonpartisan scorekeepers, right?
Generally, yes. Highly regarded for that.
And their analysis seems pretty stark. What did they find about how the benefits and burdens are actually spread out? Who gets what?
Yeah, stark is a good word. Some have called the CBO's distributive analysis brutal. Basically, it estimates that the richest 10% of households, they'd gain on average about $12,000 a year.
12,000 for the top 10%. Okay.
But here's the flip side, and it's pretty jarring. The poorest 10% could actually lose money, around $1,600 a year on average.
Lose. How?
Primarily because the funding for these tax cuts is linked to cuts in public aid programs that those households rely on.
Wow. Okay. And the middle class?
The middle class sees a much more modest gain, maybe $500 to $1,500 a year, according to the CBO. Jason Furman, who was Obama's economic advisor, said publicly he'd, quote, never seen such a severe distributive analysis from the CBO.
Never seen one like it. That's quite a statement.
It is. And others, like Daniel Hornung, who was at the National Economic Council, called it fiscally irresponsible and regressive. He pointed out that people earning under $50,000 a year would effectively see their incomes go down to pay for tax cuts for the wealthiest.
That's a really tough picture. How do the bill supporters respond to that? How do they justify those numbers?
Well, the main argument from proponents is that, the tax cuts will stimulate the economy so much.
Right, the growth argument.
Exactly. That the growth will generate enough new tax revenue to basically pay for the cuts and maybe even reduce the deficit over time.
But do independent analyses back that up? What about the overall deficit impact?
That's where it gets really interesting. The official score for just the House version adds about $2.4 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. But many independent analysts say the true cost, considering everything, could be closer to $4 trillion.
$4 trillion. How do they hide that difference?
Well, groups like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the CRFB, they've been really critical. They talk about accounting tricks. They've called it maybe the biggest and most costly budget gimmick in American history. The argument is that proponents are pretending that extending existing tax cuts doesn't count as new spending. It's a way to sort of get around Senate rules designed to control deficit spending.
So, gaming the rules, essentially.
That's the accusation. Mark Goldwayne at CRFB warned pretty directly that this approach dangerously aggravates the national debt.
Okay, so we have the claim that cuts spur growth and jobs. But we just had a big round of tax cuts in 2017. What did we actually learn from that experience? Did it deliver on those promises?
That's a really crucial comparison. Looking back at the 2017 cuts, the promise was, a big boost in jobs and wages for regular workers.
Right.
The reality, according to most analyses, was pretty modest. Job growth and wage growth didn't really accelerate much beyond the trends already happening.
So no huge surge.
Not really. What did surge was stock buybacks. Companies used a lot of their tax savings for that, over $1 trillion in 5 years, rather than massive new hiring or big pay raises across the board. Joseph Rosenberg from the Tax Policy Center concluded the 2017 cuts had relatively modest effects overall.
So the trickle-down wasn't exactly a flood?
You could say that the advertised boom didn't quite materialize for everyone.
Okay, bringing it back to this bill. What about the cost of living for you, the listener? We've heard economists like Larry Summers raise concerns about inflation, even stagflation. Can you connect those dots?
Yeah, that's a major worry. Summers has been quite vocal. His argument is that pumping this much fiscal stimulus, basically, government money, through tax cuts and spending into an economy that's already near full employment.
Could overheat things?
Exactly. It could reignite inflation. He literally warned the U.S. is on the antechamber of a stagflation and possible financial crisis.
Stagflation, that's the nasty mix of high inflation and slow growth. Right.
Precisely. It's a really tough spot for an economy. And beyond inflation, there's the debt itself. When the national debt explodes, it can push up interest rates for everybody.
How much?
Well, the Yale Budget Lab did some estimates. They figured it could cost households an extra $300 to $1,250 a year just through inflation effects, plus higher interest payments on mortgages, car loans, business loans, you name it.
So it hits your wallet directly.
Absolutely. And it's not just critics saying this. Even Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who's a former CBO director and advised Republicans, admitted this bill will worsen the fiscal picture and create upward pressure on rates.
Okay, so major economic questions. Let's shift to the spending cut side. Beyond the big numbers, what's the human impact? This bill proposes, what, $1.5 trillion in cuts to social programs?
At least that much, yeah, over
Yeah.
the next decade. And a huge chunk of that targets Medicaid.
Healthcare for low-income individuals and families.
Exactly. The estimates are around $716 billion in cuts over 10 years. A big part of that comes from adding new work requirements,
Work requirements, like what?
like needing to work or do related activities for 80 hours a month for many low-income adults to keep their coverage. The CBO thinks this could cause about 10.9 million people to lose their health insurance.
10.9 million.
Yeah, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, another think tank, puts the number even higher, potentially over 15 million. Senator Ron Wyden put it bluntly. These cuts will hurt children, elderly, Americans with disabilities.
Have Republicans been united on this?
Not entirely. There have been reports of concern, even opposition from some more moderate Republicans internally, worried about how voters back home would react to losing healthcare access. Okay, so Medicaid is a big one. What about food assistance? SNP.
SNOW, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is also facing huge cuts. Nearly $300 billion over the decade is the proposal. That was likely to be the largest cut in the program's history.
And similar mechanisms, work requirements.
Yes, stricter work requirements there too. Adults up to age 64 without dependents, and even parents with kids older than 7, would need to meet that 80-hour-a-month work threshold.
How many people could that affect?
The estimates suggest around 3 million people could lose their basic food assistance because of these changes. And it's important to remember, SNAP helps feed 1 out of every 8 Americans. That includes 1 in 5 children.
1 in 5 kids, that's sobering.
It is. Bobby Kogan at the Center for American Progress warned very directly, saying these cuts will take food from the mouth of the hungry.
Are other programs on the chopping block? And what's the broader picture here regarding inequality?
It seems likely yes. The bill appears to roll back a lot of the social aid expansions from the Obama-Biden years. So that could hit things like unemployment benefits, maybe student loan forgiveness efforts, housing subsidies, community development funds.
So a broad pullback on the safety net.
It looks that way. Plus, it also removes incentives for clean energy. And there's an anti-immigrant angle, too, potentially blocking some immigrants from accessing health programs.
So how are critics summing all this up?
Well, you hear strong language. Democrats like Senator Chuck Schumer are calling the plan Cruel and dangerous, a fiscal scam, a great broken promise. The core argument is that it's fundamentally a transfer of wealth, taken from vulnerable populations to give tax breaks to the wealthy.
And even some Republicans are uneasy.
Yeah, we mentioned the moderate concerns. But even someone like Representative Thomas Massey, who's known for being very fiscally conservative, kind of a libertarian streak, he actually defied Trump and called the bill a debt bomb about to explode.
A debt bomb. Okay, let's pull back to that bigger picture again. Trillions more in debt. What does this actually do to America's long-term fiscal health and our standing globally?
Well, adding another $3 to $4 trillion to the debt over 10 years is significant. It would keep our annual deficits up around 6 or 7% of GDP,
Which is high for peacetime.
extremely high for peacetime and relative prosperity. These are levels you usually see during major wars or deep recessions. And it has consequences. Moody's, the rating agency, already downgraded the U.S. credit rating back in May 2025.
Right, I remember that.
And they explicitly cited persistently high fiscal deficits as the reason. That directly impacts our financial credibility around the world. A lower rating can mean we have to pay higher interest rates to borrow money.
You mentioned accounting tricks earlier regarding the deficit. Can you explain a bit more how those work and why they matter beyond just the numbers?
Sure, it's about how the rules of budgeting in Congress work, especially in the Senate. Republicans are using what they call a current policy scenario. It basically lets them pretend that extending tax cuts that are already in law doesn't add to the deficit in the same way new spending would.
But extending them still costs money, right? The government still gets less revenue.
Exactly. Analysts say there's no real technical basis for saying it's not new spending or doesn't add to the deficit. It's seen as a maneuver specifically designed to get around Senate rules, the reconciliation process, which normally put limits on adding to the long-term debt.
So it weakens the process itself.
That's the big concern. Critics, like commentators in the Washington Post, called it a policy of facts accomplished, basically pushing things through by bending the rules. It erodes discipline and sets a precedent that could make it harder to control spending and debt in the future, regardless of who's in power.
And Schumer's warning.
Senator Schumer warned very starkly that these kinds of policies are a recipe for a financial disaster that will explode in our face. Strong words.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. Beyond the domestic budget, how could this mega bill affect America's role in the world, our relationships?
Well, that increased national security spending has a very specific focus. A lot of it is earmarked for massive deportation operations.
Like what specifically?
We're talking hiring 10,000 new ICE agents, setting up capacity for 100,000 detention beds, and there were even proposals, maybe from the House version initially, to tax remittances money immigrants send back home.
How would that play internationally?
It could really strain relationships, especially with neighbors like Mexico and countries in Central America. They potentially face absorbing thousands of deported people, and their economies could be hit if those remittance flows decrease.
And then there are the trade policies often associated with this approach, like the proposed universal tariffs.
All right, Trump's proposal for a 10% universal tariff on pretty much all imports. That's a huge factor.
He claims it brings in trillions, right?
He does. But again, independent estimates are much lower, maybe around $3.1 trillion over 10 years. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually only a fraction of what the tax cuts cost.
And who pays for those tariffs, ultimately?
Well, overwhelmingly, economists say consumers do. Tariffs generally act like a hidden tax. That Yale Budget Lab study estimated it could raise costs for the average American household by about $2,800 per year.
$2,800 more a year.
That's their estimate.
Yeah.
And you've already had big retailers like Walmart basically saying, look, if these tariffs happen, we'll have no choice but to raise prices.
So inflation pressure again.
Definitely. Larry Summers called the tariffs a self-inflicted wound that risks stagflation. And of course, it angers allies, the EU, Canada, Japan. They've all protested these kinds of proposals.
And all this borrowing, who are we borrowing from? Does that matter?
It matters a lot. With soaring debt, the U.S. becomes more reliant on foreign countries and investors buying our bonds, places like China, Japan. And we've seen some nervousness in the bond markets lately. If global investors get too spooked about our debt levels or our political stability, they might demand higher interest rates, or worse, start selling off U.S. debt. That could weaken the dollar and really diminish America's financial power globally.
So tying it all together, what's the bottom line for America's credibility, its leadership on the world stage?
Well, the Moody's downgrade was a clear signal. That combined with this image of, political deadlock or willingness to massively increase debt for potentially short-term political gain, it really undermines U.S. authority. When the U.S. tries to lead discussions on global finance or economic stability, other countries might look at our own house and question our standing.
Right.
As one analyst wrote in The Guardian, the U.S. is essentially playing with fire regarding its financial stability. They argued that our economic power rests heavily on trust, and this kind of plan chips away at that trust. Senator Chris Van Hollen put it very simply. He said this legislation makes America weaker, not stronger.
We've covered a ton of ground here. We've unpacked massive tax cuts, really deep cuts to social safety nets, a ballooning national debt, and these potential ripple effects across the globe. It's a lot.
It really is. And the consistent theme from critics cutting across different areas is this idea of it being a debt bomb, as Rhett Massey said, or a cruel scheme or a fiscal scam. The core criticism remains that it seems to shift burdens onto the most vulnerable to provide benefits for the wealthiest, potentially jeopardizing the country's long-term economic health and social cohesion.
Which brings us back to some fundamental questions for you, the listener, to think about. Looking at that CBO analysis, the one described as brutal, showing the poorest potentially losing income while the wealthiest gain. Is that fair? Is that the direction we want to go?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about the sheer scale of the debt, already over $36 trillion and potentially heading much higher, with warnings about stagflation from respected economists, is this path actually sustainable? Can we afford it?
Big questions.
And finally, if this isn't the right path, what are the alternatives? How else could we approach our fiscal future in a way that promotes broad prosperity without worsening inequality or damaging our standing in the world?
Lots to consider there.
Definitely. We'd love to hear what you think. Leave us your opinion in the comments. Do you think this mega bill will make America great or just more unequal?